I'm very pleased to be here, although it's a little, with this light staring in my face here, I feel like I need to be a little bit like H.L. Mencken wearing a green eye shade, which would protect me from some of this. A minute ago, Dr. Afshi asked, what is the subject of this conference? What brings us here? And I'd like to give a somewhat different answer. I think the crisis that brings us here together can be described as a media virus that is often contagious, of unknown origin, rarely fatal, but often life-threatening. This virus and its rapid spread not only makes clear that we live in one world that is interconnected at almost the speed of light, but also teaches us something about the power of language. Sticks and stones, you were told when you were young, can break your bones. Now we learn that words can do even more damage. Words can ruin your life. One or two accusations in the right place, landing on the right ears, saying that you secretly and repeatedly molested your daughter when she was 6 or 4 or 2, can establish a belief about you that will never go away. The more audible and visible this accusation, the more it lends itself to being captured in a soundbite or a headline, the more permanent the damage. And to link in with what was just mentioned about paradigms, the more the accusation resonates with the zeitgeist, the more permanent it becomes. And I think that's the position we're in now. We're beginning to realize that a media virus spreads simply by being repeated. The sheer fact of repetition can establish a certain kind of narrative truth that sets its own claim to being believed and stands apart from the results of any systematic study. It is a different kind of truth, instantly established, reinforced by repetition, and not open to discussion or qualification or even refutation. If the claim or the theory is repeated often enough, many will say that traditional studies of the sort we heard this morning are unnecessary because our knowledge is already complete. In other words, consensus spreads conviction. The source, frequently unreliable, is disregarded or forgotten, and certainty grows geometrically with the spread of the assertions. This virus is less lethal than AIDS, but every bit as virulent, and there is no known cure. I think we're recognizing now not only the problem of the false memory syndrome, but also the problem of media virus, which I think can easily take other forms in the future. It is immune to rational discussion. Once set in motion, this virus not only spreads, but it has the special capacity of being able to swallow up the middle ground of an argument and make it impossible to qualify a statement or take a moderate position. Sides become immediately polarized, and if you don't believe in child abuse, pure and simple, then you are, by definition, one of the enemy. This particular virus is hard to fight because of the complicated nature of memory and the fact that events, as you have heard, leave no permanent record in the brain. We know that when a long dry spell hits a growing forest, it leaves a permanent mark on the tree in the form of a narrow ring. Wet, humid years produce more growth and leave a wider ring. Once the tree is cut, we can inspect the ring pattern and know for certain which years were wet and which were dry. The tree remembers the weather. We have nothing like this in the brain. No means of knowing when a traumatic memory event happened to occur. Despite some 100 years of research and thousands of experiments, we still have not identified the so-called memory trace in the brain or in a CAT scan. Memory trace is a word in the language which has no referent. There is no trace. Knowledge of this kind would make our job this weekend much easier. Without it, we have to rely on the testimony of the victim and the occasional testimony of the witness, both unreliable. To add to our problems, memory plays tricks with the way we experience the world. We encounter real-time existence, say this meeting this weekend, in what might be called a narrative mode, a serial chaining of one event after another, which gives a sense of reality to our existence. The sequencing must take place at a certain speed. Notice what happens in the movies when you have slow motion frames suddenly. It becomes unreal. We have a certain sequence that we're used to. And the linkage between events must contain a certain kind of surface lawfulness which convinces us that any given happening sensibly brings about the one that followed. But this narrative mode, or script, is poorly preserved in memory. And if it's preserved at all, it is certainly not recorded as well as the individual events that make up the memory. There. If you remember then the conference this weekend, 2 weeks later, you'll remember certain scenes much more clearly than you can remember the transition from one scene to the next. As a result, we must reassemble the separate happenings each time we unpack a memory and do our best to reconstruct the sequencing that brings it back to life. But you can see that this reconstruction can vary from one time to the next, depending on what might be called our narrative taste and our overall patience. At times, I may wish to recollect a Jamesian, convoluted reconstruction of the original happening. At other times, I may decide on a much briefer and more schematic version. Just to demonstrate this, a couple of years ago, I had a minor airplane accident coming into Aspen, Colorado on a wintry day. The pilot forgot to put his wheels down. We did a belly landing on the field, and luckily there was a lot of snow and ice, and so there was no damage. But naturally, I haven't forgotten this. I did an experiment by trying to reconstruct this event 2 times, one after the Challenger disaster, and then another time after a friend of mine had just been promoted to a full professor. An unhappy occasion and a happy occasion. The 2 reconstructions are quite interesting in their differences. That is, it's the same memory, the same event, but following the Challenger disaster, I was able to resurrect details of the wheels up landing that I'd forgotten about, that had to do with the fact that as we came in for the landing, a little boy behind us burst into tears, and people started asking the stewardess what's going to happen. Other things connected with the danger and the drama of the event. That was the first recollection after the Challenger disaster. The second time, after a happier event, I remembered more of the relief I felt after landing and getting out of the plane, the upside of the memory, and it was clear that the details were shaded to account for the context, the mood that I was in. This is what happens in memory. Memory is an ongoing, real-time, here and now proposition that takes place with old material, but works it over in a here and now context. One way to, so I make this point to show you, in addition to what's been told this morning, how complicated memory is. Now, one of the things that I think is at the root of many of the troubles we're having with this false memory syndrome is that the popular model of memory is a tape recorder or a computer hard disk. This is, we're repeating an age-old mistake where we take current technology and use it as a metaphor for something we don't understand. 100 years ago, Freud used an archaeological metaphor to explain the work of psychoanalysis, uncovering the past. This wasn't an accident. 100 years ago, archaeology was in the headlines very much the way astronomy is in the headlines today. It was the up thing, the sort of the buzzword at the time. Nowadays, We know about computers, we know about camcorders, we know about cameras. This becomes our model of memory. And even though you've heard this morning that memory doesn't work this way, I think it's very easy to lapse into this kind of hard-edge, high-tech metaphor. Now, what does this mean? It means that when you hear a memory, you think that's what happened. This is told exactly as it was recorded. And but you know also that the camcorder and the hard disk makes no distinction between, say, scenic description and links between scenes. And in creating a current version of a target event, in remembering something, we use pieces of the event, never all of it, and rearrange these pieces in ways that best serve our needs in the moment, as I did with my Wheels Up landing. These basic facts of memory were shown clearly in the 30s by Sir Frederick Bartlett, and we keep having to rediscover the basic truth that memory is above all a present time activity, governed by what is true for us in the here and now, by the context. So we use adult language and grown-up concepts to capture a childhood image because we no longer think like a child. The original image of when we are 3 or 4 or 5 is repositioned and recaptioned, making it continuous with our current situation, our current adult life. Memories are always being created in the service of the present. So, memory is not a camera, but rather is really a metaphor for the past. Another way to put this is to say that all memories are pseudo-memories. Some more faithful and some less, but never veridical. This computer high-tech metaphor of memory has influenced almost every part of the current controversy. Consider the recent survey of 18,000 therapists by Dr. Gail Goodman and her associates. This study showed that the repressed memory cases, the patients of theirs who had repressed memories, experienced the abuse at a relatively young age, about 3 years, but recalled later on not a vague impression of the experience, but a large number of clearly identifiable and clearly outlined details. Both the sudden recovery of these memories and their hard edge appearance betrays an allegiance to this high-tech metaphor and violates a more sophisticated understanding of how memory works, an understanding that goes back to Bartlett and has since been fleshed out by hundreds of experiments. You can recover the file on your hard disk with the proper software and find it unchanged, even after a lapse of months or years. This is old stuff in the modern world. You can find old negatives in the attic and produce new prints of your great-grandparents. But the early memory is not that sort of thing. Unless it's repeatedly rehearsed, the details tend to fade and vagueness displaces hard fact. And this kind of repeated rehearsal is not likely to happen with a memory, say, of child abuse. So, I think it's more parsimonious to think of the memory say a memory of child abuse as a metaphor for something similar that might have happened to you, maybe with another cast of characters in a different time and place. And that's what I want to focus on this afternoon. What sorts of transformations make for these so-called memories? What do they grow out of? Let me give you some examples. The pseudo-memory could stand for a time when your mother was working, your father was away in the army, and a string of caretakers came in to cook and clean. Nobody stayed long enough to seem part of the family. Each seemed different, even dangerous. These are all strangers in the way they would make a bed, make a meal, run a bath. Years later, these vague dangers, these intrusions into your private space, could become transformed into something more concrete and recognizable. In other words, this kind of vague unhappiness, which touches on boundary violation and something you can't quite put your finger on, becomes turned into a memory of specific abuse or interference. If, say, you happen to be a patient in therapy and you're uncertain about whether or not your therapist is really interested in you, a detailed remembering of such an event of abuse could be just a ticket to hold the therapist spellbound and persuade him that you're in need of special treatment. Telling a gradually unfolding story of child abuse may be a surefire way of having that special relationship with the therapist that you're looking for all your life. So it has a function then in the therapeutic situation of presenting him with something that he wants to hear, he or she wants to hear. A memory of abuse might also be a metaphor about parts of the past that are hard to put into words. It might be a metaphor for growing up, say, as your parents were getting a divorce. A transformed memory of coming home to a house full of argument and waking up one morning to find your father gone and a stranger taking his place. Another kind of boundary violation. Decades of hard times, struggling families, and punctured marriages have left their mark on lost childhoods with all too familiar results. And I think we're beginning to discover that some of the pain and suffering of the past may be in the process of being recaptured in these memories of child abuse, or memories of cult ritual torture, or even accounts of abductions by extraterrestrials. For the young, bewildered, latchkey youngster who has no home, juggling two sets of parents, what's happening to him is just as outlandish, frightening, and impossible to describe as, say, a visit from outer space would be for us today. It's equivalent in terms of terror, and the details, I think, shouldn't mislead you into hearing that something is being told here which may not literally have been the way it's described. The argument becomes especially clear when we turn to satanic cult rituals and spaceship landings. As you have heard, there's no hard evidence to support either activity. The number of verified reports from the field has lagged far behind the number of witness descriptions. This discrepancy between what is known and what is told makes it all the more likely that these stories are better treated as metaphors. Metaphors for something we're surrounded by and either can't describe as children or do not want to recognize as adults. And some, although certainly not all, reports of child abuse, I think, can be treated in the same fashion. The truth, I think, lies in the anguish and suffering of these reports, not necessarily in the details. And we do a disservice to the sufferers to take their stories as literal recountings of awful happenings and mount a search for the guilty party and bring him to trial or whatever. To focus on the guilty parent can easily end up accusing an innocent victim and misunderstanding the fact that this is a metaphor for something that was quite different. I'm making the argument then that many memories of child abuse may represent a kind of narrative convention, a way of presenting the despair and desperation of a recent happening in a way that will attract attention. This is particularly true now in this zeitgeist with this kind of thing so much in the air. The child abuse story can be seen as a piece of dramatic license, a necessary embellishment to make you listen and make you pay attention. We make the mistake of listening to these stories literally because we believe that memory works like a computer hard disk. This must have been what happened. But as soon as we realize that memory doesn't work that way, we should listen to the child abuse story as a kind of metaphor or transformation that is governed by the rules that make up dream work. We no longer make the mistake of treating dreams literally, to use them, say, to forecast the future. We hear them as comments on recent events, and we don't take them literally, and we assume that the recent event has been transformed and worked over to turn into the dream. Same thing happens with stories of child abuse. The same mechanisms are at work. I think to help us make sense of these transformations, we need to make a catalog of various kinds of invasions of privacy at different stages of development. and in this way sensitize ourselves to the ways in which dimensions of privacy can change in relation to stages of development. The advent of stranger anxiety, which you all know about, around 2, marks an obvious beginning. Can we identify other times when the growing child feels violated by babysitters, doctors, patients, and other persons who seem manifestly innocent? As we begin to learn more about how these events turn into memories of abuse, then we can sensitize ourselves to what may be violations of the child's space that we should be aware of as we are parents. In other words, this then turns into training us to become better parents, as we understand how what seem like innocent happenings at the time can easily become transformed later on into something quite terrifying. Let me just give you a few examples. The son of a friend of mine, when he was 10, had a precocious boy, and he'd been reading a book by Erickson called Childhood and Society. Many of you may know that. This boy felt so invaded by the author. He felt that he knew so much about how this boy, thought and behaved, that this book was a danger to, should be banned from the libraries. This book was telling more than should be told. He felt invaded by the Erickson and by how much he knew about human development. Now, this is an extreme case, but what I'm getting at is that this kind of experience then, that he had then, could easily be transformed later on into a memory of some other kind of abuse. It would be interesting to go back and see how he did remember that particular thing. For another kind of transformation, I'll give you a memory of Marcia Johnson, a psychologist in Princeton, who was driving with her family in California when they had a flat tire. It's in the summertime in the desert. They had no spare, and so her father had to hitchhike to a gas station to fix the tire, and the rest of the family waited in the car. It was over 100 degrees. After waiting a while and getting more uncomfortable and thirsty, her sister walked up to a nearby farmhouse with some empty pop bottles, and the owner there had a little bottled water, and she filled up the bottles, and the sister came back to the car. Marcia and her family drank it all up, and Marcia remembers feeling guilty that there was no water left for her father when he came back with the tire. Now, she told this story to her family many years later. Her parents laughed and said, "No, it didn't quite happen that way. The father hitchhiked to the gas station. Yes, that much was true. The rest was all make-believe. The family waited in the car. Yes. The sister complained. The sister started crying, and it seems likely that Marcia must have been daydreaming about how wouldn't it be nice if she could get rid of her sister and get rid of the thirst at the same time. How to do that? Have the sister go off to the farmhouse, okay, get out of the car, fill the bottles with water, come back, and this kind of memory transformation follows obvious wish-fulfilling rules, the way dreams are formed. I think another kind of transformation takes place, and this is a little more worrisome. It takes place by therapists who are convinced of child abuse, either because they believe it in general or because they believe that they were abused as children. Therefore, they listen to their clients with a particular ear to hearing the story of child abuse all over again. Let me give you just one recent published account. A patient tells a dream in which I was in the house in the suburbs where I grew up. I was on the second floor. There were two people who were adults. I was a child. They were kissing and starting to make love. I didn't know what I was doing there. A man was coming up the stairs, maybe my father. I was terrified and helpless. The two people who were making love were too involved with each other, and I needed help. This dream was treated by the therapist as, quote, among the first signs that incest was a possible factor in the patient's experience. You see how this happens. If incest and child abuse are in the forefront of your thoughts, you may easily come to see a dream like this as a derivative of early child abuse. And I think we might later on want to discuss if we should think about if therapists really feel that they have been abused as children. Maybe they should think of disqualifying themselves as therapists for patients who are you see what I'm getting at. It may be that there's so much suggestion operating here that it might be the safer thing for both parents and for patients and their parents to come into a sort of risk-free environment. Right. So let me end with an appeal to you. As parents, many of you have been bewildered by the accusations leveled against you. And I would like, if you could send me, if you can think of a likely event that might have been the germ for the accusation. A likely event that you know about that can be documented that later could be turned into an accusation of abuse. I would very much like to hear from you. I think we need to collect a catalog of the target event and what it turns into so that we can begin to understand this kind of transformation. And this, I think, would help a lot to make us understand how this kind of change comes about. So let me end on that note and remind you that the virus is spreading and it will take our combined efforts to slow it down, but I'm glad we're banding together here to do battle. There couldn't be a more worthy cause. Thank you very much.